Welcome back, everyone, for this afternoon's session on climate justice. I'm a little bit conscious of time, so I'm just going to get straight into it now. We've got an amazing lineup for this afternoon's session. We've got 3 talks from speakers who will be tuning in with us live from Zoom from across the world. And then we will have a panel discussion with a couple of other speakers as well. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker for tonight. We have Leah Thomas, who is the author and founder of Intersectional Environmentalist, and she's based in Los Angeles, California in the US, and she's coined the term eco-communicator to describe her style of environmental activism. Leah uses her passion for writing and creativity to explore and advocate for the critical yet often overlooked relationship between social justice and environmentalism. With this intersection in mind, Leah founded and launched the non-profit organisation Intersectional Environmentalist, a platform and resource hub that aims to advocate for environmental justice, provide educational resources surrounding intersectional environmentalism, and promote inclusivity and accessibility within environmental education and movements. And building on her work in the field, she penned The Intersectional Environmentalist, which I've got a copy of right here, an amazing read. It's called How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. And this book serves as an introduction to the intersection between environmentalism, racism, and privilege, and as an acknowledgement of the fundamental truth that we cannot save the planet without protecting all of its people. She's also the founder of the eco-lifestyle blog Green Girl Leah, at Green Girl Leah. You can find her on Instagram under that, where she uses her multiple years of eco-focused educational and work experience to inform her ever-expanding list of projects and connect with her audience of more than 400,000 followers across her channels. She has been named to several notable lists, including Time 100, Next, Insider's Climate Action 30, Marie Claire's Creators to Watch, Ebony Power 100, and InStyle's The Badass 50, and is an established public speaker who has presented at Google, 1% for the Planet's Global Summit, Dreamforce, and more. Leah, I'm hoping you're here and you're ready to go. If we could please pop her up on the screen, that would be amazing. And can we give her all a big welcome of applause? Hey, Leah.
Thank you all so much for having me. I think I'm waiting for Sophie, who will be joining me as well.
I'm Sophie. Hi! So I probably should have mentioned, yes, so this is not actually a talk from Leah, this is a conversation with Leah. So we're going to be having like a fireside chat. I'll be asking Leah some questions. I don't think we probably won't have time for questions from the audience, but yeah, anyway, nice to meet you, Leah. Let's get straight into it. So, before we define exactly what intersectional environmentalism is, I would love for you to start with the story of how you got there and what inspired you to coin this term.
Absolutely. So I grew up in kind of the middle of the United States. I was in an area where I was always running around and playing with animals, and later I found out about an environmental science and policy program when I went to do my studies a little later in life, but it always just felt a little bit incomplete. I was one of the only Black students in my classroom, and I feel like I really learned about sustainability because of so many traditions of my Black elders and ancestors, and I carried that into my sustainability work. So I really wanted to focus on how different people's cultures related to how they cared about the environment. And that's when I stumbled across intersectional theory and intersectional feminism, which I talk about in my book, which really considers the ways overlapping identity aspects impact someone's life, from race to gender to spirituality, median income, and more. So I really wanted to focus on environmentalism, but also make sure that I could study identity at the same time and implement social justice. And that led me to all sorts of things, from being a National Park Service ranger and trying to uncover different stories in the United States of communities of color, to working at companies like Patagonia on their communications team, and then ultimately founding the nonprofit Intersectional Environmentalist and writing the book, which seeks to highlight diverse environmental stories.
Amazing. And, oh, we've got a bit of applause. And so what is your definition of intersectional environmentalism?
That's a great question. It's such a big word. I think there's like 12 syllables or so, but in essence, it really means protecting both people and the planet, because those things are really linked. But when I wrote the definition a couple years ago, I said that intersectional environmentalism is a type of environmentalism that advocates for all communities and diverse communities and the planet. And it recognizes the ways that the communities that are most impacted by the climate crisis, which are Black, Indigenous, communities of color, and lower income communities that are facing the brunt of the climate crisis right now, how we need to prioritize amplifying their voices, and that any type of environmentalism that ignores these injustices, in my opinion, is incomplete. So it really advocates for the importance of diverse environmental leadership, understanding who's being the most impacted by environmental injustice, but it's not only about the trauma of environmental injustice, it's also about the beauty of diversity and the beauty that environmental education, what it can look like if we include all those wonderful diverse stories and perspectives.
And I remember reading in your book as well that you struggled because you, on the one hand, were trying to kind of choose between advocating for racial justice versus advocating for the climate crisis, and you sort of felt like, yeah, maybe I'll let you explain that in your own words.
Absolutely. So environmental justice as a field of study has existed for decades, but it's really been siloed, especially in the United States, and I'm sure other places all around the world. It's kind of been environmentalism over here that focuses on conservation or even climate science behind the climate crisis, and then environmental justice all the way over here, which always felt really silly to me, because if the protection of the smallest of endangered species can exist over in this category, where we're talking about the protection of things like salmon and fish and like algae, then why is the protection of indigenous communities and the communities most impacted all the way over here? So that's why I think it's really important to talk about these things, who's being the most impacted, what stories are being left out of environmental education, just to make sure it's more complete. And if we want everyone to be stewards of the planet, how beautiful would it be if environmental storytelling was infused with those different cultures? So it was something that was really frustrating, but I'm also just really happy in the work that I do right now when I get to see Black and Brown and Indigenous students learn about their environmental history. It's just so empowering.
Amazing. And in your book, and you've touched on it briefly here as well, you say that environmentalism without social justice is incomplete, but can also be more damaging. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is this like widely popularized idea of green growth, and this idea of like continuing business as usual, but in a world that is greener, like more renewable energy, for example, will somehow save the planet. And I know you've written a fair bit on this as well, so I'd love for you to like explain why social justice needs to be included in our understandings of saving the planet.
Absolutely, and thanks for that question. It needs to be in the equation, because who are we saving the planet for? Because if we're talking about the climate crisis and a hypothetical future that's going, unfortunately, is very likely to happen, and we're talking about natural disasters and things like that, it's not absent from people. Because oftentimes when people are saying that, they're saying, I want to protect the future for generations to come, for my grandchildren, my children, etc. But making sure that if they know that they're saving the planet for their future children, their current children, their grandchildren, that everyone can also be in that equation, and that we can also talk about how different communities all around the world are being impacted by the climate crisis or will be impacted by it, because everyone deserves to have a safe and equitable planet for themselves presently, or for 7 generations to come. So it's really harmful to separate that or not understand the urgency of the present in addition to saving the planet in the future, because there are people who don't have access to clean air and clean water right now. So by ignoring that, we'll have a better shot of saving the future if we can also address very urgent environmental injustices in the present that are impacting a lot of people.
Yeah, totally. And I guess to add to that as well, in your book, I love how you say the same systems of oppression that harm people also harm the planet. And you list a few of those systems in your book and you unpack them, which I think is amazing. And it relates a lot to what we've been learning at Newkind as well. We've obviously been covering racism, capitalism, colonialism. Do you want to add anything to that, or like kind of unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah, I think a really cool field of study that introduced me to the world of intersectional environmentalism was ecofeminism, and in particular radical ecofeminism, which isn't as steeped in gender roles and things like that, but it talks about the patriarchy and how oftentimes in societies where they degrade and disrespect women, those same societies often degrade and disrespect the environment. So there's a lot of important connections there to how society treats people and how it also values the planet at the same time. And that's just one field of study, and we can look at that with other systems of oppression as well, like capitalism and greed and racism, etc. So yeah, I really enjoyed writing the book, and I know we only have a little bit of time, but I really get into it. And I think learning about the basis of intersectional theory is really important. And also a group called the Kumbaya River Collective, where they had a statement along the lines of, if Black women were free, then all women would be free, because that would require the destruction of multiple systems of oppression, from racism to sexism to the patriarchy and more. And that really influences the work that I do, because it takes all of us being free and not just a select few.
Amazing. Love that. So I don't want to keep you much longer because I know we're running a little bit over time. So maybe just one last question. How do you see this idea of intersectional environmentalism being used across individuals, organizations, communities? What was your intention behind it to release it into the world?
Yeah, it's been really beautiful seeing the different ways that it has been used, because with me in particular, it was my specific experience as a Black woman in America, but it looks and feels different for everyone because all of us have different identity aspects. And one thing that I thought was really cool, I studied comparative world religions when I was in school as well. I'm not particularly religious, but I've been talking to a lot of different religious groups or interfaith groups that want to be like climate justice churches or groups, because that's a key aspect of their identity. And honestly, I'm like, whatever brings people to want to save the planet, as long as it's, a good thing, then let's do it. So it's just been really awesome seeing people relate different aspects of their identity and that really propelling them to act. And I think it just shows the importance of really meeting people where they're at and not really coming from a place of judgment, but coming from a place of accessibility, getting to know people. And you'd be surprised how many more people would really just want to sign on to help protect the planet if you can relate it back to them.
Totally. And I think you're a testament to that, with just how quickly you went viral when you first released that Instagram square that said environmentalists for Black Lives Matter. Check out Leah's profile and read up a little bit more about that, because it's incredible and shows, I suppose, the power of social media and communication for spreading social change and kind of like understanding how these different systems of oppression interact and expanding the way that we think about environmentalism. So amazing job for tapping into that. And you're doing incredible work. It's an honor to have you here with us. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you so much. Okay, so if all goes to plan, we've got Dr. Hannah McGlade, who should be tuning in now. Is she online, Tech Crew? Maybe just in the meantime, I'll introduce you to her. Oh, there she is. Hi, Dr. Hannah. Hi. I'm just going to introduce you for a second before we start. So, Dr. Hannah McGlade is from the Kurrin Menang people in Western Australia. Her lifelong work has focused on justice for Aboriginal people, racism and discrimination, Aboriginal women and children, incarceration and state violence, culture and heritage protection. As an academic, activist, and writer, Hannah's human rights work includes the national and international sphere of the United Nations, where she is appointed to the UN Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues. An associate professor at Curtin University, Dr. McGlade, has always worked closely with Noongar community and is an advisor to the Noongar Council for Family Safety and Wellbeing. Hannah, it's amazing to have you with us here tonight. Thank you for tuning in. I'll hand it over to you to address us. You're up on the screen and all ready to go.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you, Sophie and Newkind. It's really inspiring to see what you're doing, and I really want to learn more, actually, about you. I was hoping that we'd also have a fireside chat, but as I said to the organiser, climate justice, it's not the area that I've worked in, it's state violence, and Irfan said to me, but it's the connections that we need to make. So perhaps I'll have a yarn, that's our way of talking with each other about some of that work that I've been doing, and obviously those connections about violence to our lands and the risks that we're facing together. I grew up in the activist history here in Noongar country. We now call Borlu as well, in the 1960s and 70s, and I pay respects to my elders and the elders of across our country who led the way really in the fight for Aboriginal justice through decades. Here in my country, people don't know much about our movement, our civil rights movement. It's been a whitewashed history, and I like to remind people and remind myself of some of our leaders, such as Bill Harris in 1928, suffering the genocidal history that was in full force at that time, which segregated our people to missions and reserves, including my own grandmother, and forced them to live in very shocking conditions we could hardly imagine today. And Bill Harris, in 1928, led a delegation of Noongar men who called themselves the Native Union, and they were actually reported to be the first recognised Aboriginal delegation engaging with mainstream politics in Australia. They led a delegation to the Premier. They were actually received by the then Premier to talk about the risks and the life that they were experiencing, and they feared actually the extermination of Noongar people as a result of what was being done. And some of that history is being brought to light through a study of actually the letters that Indigenous people wrote to the colonial appointed protector, A.O. Neville, in the state, who for over 20 plus years was known to be particularly cruel in his approach, particularly the removal of Aboriginal children to missions and places where extreme cruelty was experienced, for which we haven't recovered today. And those letters and that letter project that has been showing the experiences, the lived experiences of Aboriginal people in those days, including mothers pleading for some clean water for their sick babies and being, denied clean water. Just some examples. We need to bring these stories to life. We do need truth-telling in this country. There's nothing more important that we can do, but we can't forget the structural reforms that also need to take place to respect Indigenous people's rights. Of course, our rights have been violated more often than ever respected, and that is making our land very vulnerable today. In the Noongar language, our land is our budja. When a woman is pregnant, she's known as being budjari. This is really a reflection of that close relationship that women had with land. A relationship that has been now denied to many of our people. Many of our children are never even taken back to country to know their own country and the spirituality of their country, and instead are facing, and families are facing, systems of violence by the state, including removal of children and incarceration of children. I've been working in that area, particularly for women and children's safety and wellbeing, for some time, and it is my priority. You might have seen the news across Australia around the various detention centres and prisons and the treatment of youth, and they are particularly Indigenous youth, suffering even risk to their lives. We're very concerned about the safety of Aboriginal children, at the Banksia Detention Centre here in Perth, which has been documented to be cruel and inhumane, violating international human rights law standards, particularly the placing of children and young people who are at risk of self-harm in solitary confinement for many months and perhaps even up to a year. It's been documented, many self-harm attempts. Many children who are being treated in this way have neurological disability issues for which they're denied treatment. So we're launching a strong campaign against our state government, and it's very unusual that we actually have support from the state newspaper at this time, who for the last 2 weeks have been highlighting what is happening. Our Premier has refused to meet even with Indigenous people, although he's called a summit tomorrow because of the high level of attention and criticism. So we're standing really strong here in Noongar country, but we know that the children are at risk, and some of the restraints actually being used, a method called folding up, can actually pose a risk to life. And we know that Aboriginal people certainly have lost their lives in detention centres, and now we see it being done to our own children. Aboriginal women, we know, are at very high risk of murder and violence in Australia, and we have a Senate inquiry at the moment into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, which I've already consulted with. We have an excellent case study on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls from an international perspective, involving Australia, Canada and the US, and documenting Indigenous femicide and using the work of Aboriginal and Indigenous artists nationally and internationally to do that. So I recommend, if you would like to learn more about that, to look into our case study online, Indigenous Femicide, The Killing Times. Our people and our connection to land has long been subjected to violence from the state. As a young person, as an activist, I learnt about my heritage and the way that our land and our culture is, really much a part of who we are. We tried to protect our sites. We tried to protect one site which was known to be the resting place of the Woggle, the ancestral rainbow creation spirit. And we failed, even though we protested for 2 years outside Gunninana. We could not get our heritage protected. The only heritage that was ever protected was non-Indigenous heritage, European. That's the culture that I've grown up in, and it's an environment of racism that we have to oppose. Last year I worked with elders from throughout the state of West Australia who were deeply concerned about legislation, the Aboriginal Heritage Act, which again gave the Minister and the government of the day the unfettered right to approve damage and destruction to Aboriginal heritage and sacred sites. And we saw that happen, the implications of that with the blasting of the sacred Newkind Gorge site. But there were many sites. There are many sites that have been destroyed. In its existence of over 20 years, only 3 heritage sites were ever denied an application under the law for damage or destruction. So what we had was a system authorised through law of this destroying Aboriginal culture and failing to respect. So I worked with the elders to lodge a complaint to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Race Discrimination, and we're waiting for our complaint to be determined by the committee, I'm hopeful, because I know that they're made up of race discrimination experts appointed independently. I do have some positivity that a good decision will be made. I don't think our government will listen, but these are the mechanisms that we are using, and I acknowledge the people of the Torres Strait Island who took their complaint about what has been done to the Torres Strait. The dire risk to their lifestyle, to their families, to their own, their integrity, their cultural integrity, and they took that complaint to the UN Human Rights Committee, who finalised and upheld that decision in September, finding Australia had violated their rights to culture, to family, even to life, and ordering the Australian government to make reparation and address that, including through appropriate climate change measures. I've recently just come back from a meeting in Chile to discuss reconciliation, truth-telling and transitional justice. And these are very important issues for our country, particularly as it was founded on the lie of terra nullius, that Australia was an empty land, or that our people were not to be treated in a respectful manner. The terra nullius lie was denounced in Mabo decision, but our sovereignty was not recognised by that case. In fact, the High Court avoided any recognition of it. Our report from this meeting will be available. It was very sad to be in Chile at this time because of the historic referendum for the constitutional change for the environment and Indigenous rights was defeated only 8 weeks ago or so. Indigenous people told us at the meeting, the Mapuche people, that a campaign was waged against the recognition of Indigenous rights. What a great shame for the people of Chile, and even for us worldwide, that we saw racism raise its head and through the media and institutions defeat a historic referendum for environment and Indigenous rights. In Australia, we now are facing a similar crossroads, I think. We have some time, another year or so, before we will go to a vote about voice, treaty and truth, and installing a political voice, an Indigenous voice in the Australian Constitution. I'm in favour of the voice. At this point, we have no national Indigenous body. We've had ATSIC in the past, we had a National Congress, and they've all been defunded or disbanded by government. So we need to, fight for these structural reforms. After voice, we'll be in a stronger position to negotiate treaty, and I think that will allow us to look more closely at our human rights obligations, including the right to a healthy environment, which I was really happy to learn about in Stockholm recently. It was a great win for people worldwide to have that recognised. But of course, the important treaties and the prohibition of race discrimination and violence to women, of children's rights, these are all important. They're all founded in the Commonwealth Constitution and the external affairs powers, but our federal government is not taking seriously and responding to UN international human rights law, posing real problems for our country. And of course, we will also have a commitment by this government to a truth-telling process, to a Makarrata Commission to oversee all three. It is an exciting time, but I'm not naive about the extent of racism and oppression in Australia today, and I have some fear and concern. I think these alliances that we seek to build, including in forums such as this, are absolutely critical to protecting our country and our future. So thank you for inviting me to speak today.
Thank you, Hannah. How are we going with time? I'm just not sure if we've got time for questions. Okay, maybe not. Thank you so much, Hannah. It was amazing to have you on. Really appreciate you jumping in and being with us today. I think we've just got one more call with Dr. Mittul Vahanvati, who is tuning in from India today, but she is a senior lecturer at RMIT. Let me just find her bio. There it is. So Mittul is a senior lecturer in sustainability and urban planning discipline at RMIT University. Her research is situated at the intersection of disaster recovery planning, housing, reconstruction, community resilience, and climate change adaptation. She focuses on two aspects of recovery and resilience: institutional recovery program design, government structure, and project delivery approaches that assisted community recovery and hazard mitigation in the longer term, That was all one. And two, the ability of communities to make housing and city planning decisions informed by disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. She adopts a co-design and knowledge co-production approach in her applied research, which sits in cross-cultural settings. She has conducted research in India, Solomon Islands, and regional Australia, and her research is funded by UN bodies, including UN Habitat, UNEP, UNFCCC, national and local government, as well as non-government organisations. And she currently leads 2 research groups at RMIT on climate change transformations and Future Urban Researchers Network. Dr. Mittul, are you here with us today? Yeah. Well, there she is. Welcome. We can see you. And can we hear you? Hello?
Yes, very clear.
Amazing. Take it away.
Thanks.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Clancy. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I originally live in Melbourne on the land of Boiburung and Boiburung language groups. But currently I'm in India conducting my research work on housing recovery after more than 10 years after disasters. So as mentioned by Clancy, my research focuses at the intersection of inequality, inadequacy, and injustice. So the 3 I's, and housing at the center of all the 3 of them. There is more than 1/3 of global population currently living in inadequate housing, and I'll explain what it means. Inadequate means that either you don't have proper walls, roofs, structurally made walls, roofs, or floor, so mud floor, or the house doesn't have land tenure, so you're not certain when you'll have to leave, or you don't have running water coming to the house, or you don't have toilets. So any of this means it's inadequate. So people living in those conditions, typically in informal settlements or slums, as we know, they are living in an inadequate situation. It is complete opposite of livable environments. Yeah, so those people living in those inadequate housing situation, they are already in a position of socioeconomic inequity. They are either staying there because they're not economically well-to-do, or they don't have good social connections to be able to get support that they require to have access to land tenure or build their house or get money from the bank. So those social capital and lack of economic capital puts them at a very marginalized condition where they are not able to get out of poverty. And the third one is injustice, which is what this conference is about. And when I was approached, I had the same answer as the previous speaker, that I don't necessarily work in that space, but I work in around that space of injustice. And the concept of injustice has changed over time from environmental injustice to climate injustice. But the crux of it is that there are people who haven't contributed to it, but are disproportionately impacted by it. So these group of people that I'm talking to you about, and all the previous speakers have spoken about in terms of gender or indigenous people, and when the people who are living in socioeconomic inequality, they are all vulnerable to the impact of climate change. And they get impacted way more than those who are well-to-do, in much safer locations, in much stronger built houses. They also have insurance and buffers in terms of connections, social connections. They can go to someone else's place. They can do all those things which this group of people just cannot. And what happens is it has a ratcheting effect. on their pre-existing condition. If there were flood event, or if there was a heat wave, they tend to spend all their savings on just trying to cope with that one event, and they just continue going down on a downward spiral of poverty. If their house gets destroyed during a disaster, governments take that opportunity, as what happened in India, take that opportunity to get rid of the entire slum area because it's high value in inner city area, and try to relocate them in the outer suburbs and forget about them. So these things have happened again and again and again, where their needs, their priorities are just forgotten. And so I often call them forgotten communities or forgotten people whose voices need to be heard and put out there in front of NGOs and government. And that's the sort of work I have been doing in India during my PhD 12 years ago. I'm revisiting those places again. 2001 Gujarat earthquake in Indian state, which was one of the worst earthquakes seen by the country, over 1 million homes destroyed. And 2008 Bihar floods, where again, a huge population was devastated. And in Solomon Island, I'm working with urban informal settlements, and collaboratively, we have developed a shelter guide. Communities have said what they need immediately after disaster, as in 11 informal settlements, people have agreed, and we have documented what they need in terms of aid to come out of poverty, to recover, and to rebuild their houses and their lives. So housing is just the platform on the basis of which people can improve their lives. If they don't have that platform, if they don't have land right, if they don't have a secure home, then every year they end up putting money on it in trying to maintain it. And those who have had a house, they have started saving and putting their kids to school. They have had savings and they're investing in livelihood. But those who don't have a proper foundation, the basic universal need, housing, they just can't progress anywhere. So I'm writing a book right now with a scholar from Japan and Thailand, comparing India, Japan, Thailand, the housing recovery, and focused on the most vulnerable and forgotten communities. That will be coming out next year. But thanks for inviting me, and that's it from me now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mittul. Let's jump into the panel and dive a bit deeper, I think. I'm just going to invite Varsha Yajman and Amy Gordan up onto the stage, and I'm going to introduce them as well. So Varsha Yajman is the coordinator at Sapna South Asian Climate Solidarity Network. She is an Indian Australian climate justice and mental health youth advocate and has been an organiser for School Strike for Climate and the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. Varsha is currently studying law and politics at the University of Sydney, is a coordinator at Sapna South Asian Climate Solidarity, and paralegal at Equity Generation Lawyers, which conducts climate change litigation. As a woman of colour, Varsha's work also focuses on the importance of amplifying the voices of young South Asians and young people who are impacted by mental issues and climate change. Her work aims to create a community for young South Asian Australians to feel represented and empowered. Thank you for being here, Varsha. And we also have Amy Gordan, who is the First Nations Justice Campaigns Director at Get Up. She is a Gureng woman and the First Nations First Nations Justice Campaigns Director at Get Up. She's been working on First Nations and climate justice for the last 15 years, including as Campaign Director at AYCC. She's also worked as an organiser in the US, working on refugee rights and strengthening gun laws. Amy is passionate about building the capacity of young mob and telling the stories of our people. So let's get into it. Hi. So I'm going to get straight into it and ask, how did we get here? How did we get here in terms of this climate crisis? What has happened?
The capitalism, racism, industrialization, colonization, all the just like so much. That's the only way that I could put it. I think just the fact that the climate crisis is, I think, a manifestation of several injustices combined, and I think to me that's why I love the whole idea of climate justice as an issue, because I think it just brings so many different things together. And I think just in like the previous speakers, you can see how like assault and like violence and things like that, as well as like housing and health, all of those things do come together under climate justice. And I think just the conversations this morning as well around race, like every single time somebody said something, I was like, yeah, I know what that is. Like, I've experienced that. I've had to like shut my mouth because I'm too scared that, you know, maybe we won't get funding, or maybe this will happen if I say something. And I think that's just the reality of the climate crisis. And I think that's what's perpetuating it as well, because you can't say anything. And if you do say something, then you might not have a place to say anything anymore in the future. So it's just kind of continued oppression, but under the guise of like, we're doing good things and we're woke because of the climate movement, but it's really not that woke.
Want to acknowledge that, you know, today we're meeting on stolen land of the Wurundjeri people here in the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and respect to my elders too. And I think for me, at the heart of this climate crisis is that it's colonisation. Since the colonisation of this country, and since land was stolen from mob, we have had this issue of mining and extractive industries that we have seen continue to happen up until this very day. And I think when I talk to people about the climate crisis, I talk about how First Nations communities in this country are on the front lines of both the impacts. You know, we've seen fires over the last few years. We've seen floods in Lismore this year. We're on the front lines of those impacts, but we're also on the front lines of those extractive industries, you know, from Gomeroi mob in New South Wales, W&J up in North Queensland, to, you know, mob in the NT fighting fracking. Mob are leading these fights, but at the end of the day, this is about stolen land, and it's about, you know, government and corporation control of that land, and the lack of consent that these companies have is a really big issue. And I think that's at the heart of this crisis in this country.
Totally, absolutely. And I want to bring it back to what we've been talking about already this morning, is racism as being cultural superiority, and the justification for colonisation and capitalism was this idea that, you know, some human beings based on the colour of their skin are subhuman, not as worthy, not as like able to be exploited, able to be dispossessed. Those kind of ideas are underpinning where we are today. And obviously capitalism as well, as you mentioned, Varsha. This idea that our environment is something to be extracted, to be commodified. These are not First Nations values or understandings.
It's not an Indigenous worldview, right?
No.
Like, you know, we mob all across the country have a deep connection to country and culture and caring for country. You know, that goes back generations and generations, like, you know, tens of thousands of years, and that carries through our blood and through generations and through storytelling and songlines and all of those things. And that at the heart of colonisation, they tried to wipe that out. But I think on the flip side of that, the solutions exist in mob. Solutions for this climate crisis and how we protect country and how we, you know, stop these extractive industries exist in mob, and you see that in these fights. You know, I think there's this community that mob have that is really at the core of how we solve this. You know, I briefly talked about Lismore mob up there and on Bundjalung country, and you know, I know a bunch of mob up there, and with the floods, you know, houses were going under. They had no houses, but they were rallying together and pulling resources and pulling food and pulling places for people to sleep when the government was refusing to act, when the government was trying to ignore this crisis that was happening. Houses were going underwater, mob were going missing. The government was ignoring it, but it was that community that was stepping up and fighting, and I think that's the culture, and that's how we get out of this mess that we've, you know, that we're in right now, is by looking at that, right?
Totally. Yeah, that's this like collectivist culture that you have where you naturally want to uplift the well-being of everybody as opposed to this individualist culture that capitalism is based off, this extraction for one's own self-interest, greed, money, power. And I guess touching on power again as well, when we spoke the other day, you mentioned the voice to Parliament and the upcoming referendum. Yeah. And I want to ask you, how do you see this idea of power, reclaiming power, I should say, playing out in terms of climate justice here in Australia? I mean, I'll let you take over there.
Look, I think we're in a really unique moment in this country. Over the next year, First Nations issues are going to have a really huge platform. And, you know, I think our old people have been talking about truth-telling and treaty and fighting for that for a really long time. You know, what we do at Get Up is really work closely with community and talk about the issues that community care about. And, you know, that is fracking country. It's, you know, deaths in custody. It's looking at housing and the lack of money going into housing. It's looking at healthcare in community. It's looking at the destruction of culture. You know, Dr. Hannah mentioned Juukan Gorge. Like, that moment shed this light on what is happening to the destruction of culture in this country like no other moment really in the last little while, and a lot of attention and a lot of eyes were on what was happening. And I think this referendum is going to be another moment for that, and for looking at truth-telling and looking at treaty and looking at what are the actual solutions to these problems that people are saying are existing in community. What are the solutions there, and how is this going to help? How is this referendum going to shape that? And I think this referendum provides that window for us to talk about these issues and talk about what's happening in our communities like we haven't had in the past in our generation. I think referendums are incredibly difficult. I think something like 8 out of 44 referendums have actually passed. And so we're looking at a really big challenge. I think we're also looking at a really big racist no campaign. The likes of the Murdoch press, people like Andrew Bolt, are going to be running their lines. That is going to be incredibly difficult. And we need to keep coming back to these issues that community are talking about. Deaths in custody. You know, we're working right now on Common Walker's inquest in Alice Springs. A young man was shot by the police in his own community. There was a murder trial. He was found not guilty. In this inquest, the racism that has been exposed by the police force is not shocking to mob. We know this exists. We know it happens. But I think it's showing the rest of the country what's happening, and I think we need to use this moment to push on a bunch of our issues and get change on some of those issues that we're really talking about. I think the other thing that I'll say before I'll pass along, you know, another big issue we know is voter suppression in this country. You know, we do a lot of electoral participation work, and, you know, we work a lot in the NT and in North Queensland, and An election doesn't happen on election day in remote communities. It happens for a window of maybe half an hour to an hour. Tuesday, 2 weeks before the election, the AEC will roll in. If people are in community, they'll vote. If they're not, they won't. There are big issues with, big language barrier issues, things not being translated into language. There are issues with no interpreters, all of those types of things. We know that there's a really big problem with voter suppression in this country that's been quite deliberate by the Conservative government. And so we really need to fix that problem before we go to a vote, because if mob aren't voting on this, then that's a really big problem.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to jump to Varsha now and tap into the environmental movement here, I guess, in so-called Australia, but also around the world. I'd love to hear your experience in the environmental movement here. Who's leading it? Who's running these organisations? And is that the very
That's a
same?
tricky question.
Yeah, let's answer it. Let's go there.
It's certainly not First Nations people, or when I joined it wasn't. It wasn't people of colour for sure. I'm pretty new to it. So I joined in 2018 and started with a really great organisation, and it had a lot more people of colour than I'd been around in quite a while, because I went to a really white high school. So I was always one of the few people of colour. So then when I went into a movement that had a few more than that, I was like, great, we've ticked the box, this is incredible. And I also think like a large part of me wanted to suppress the POC identity, right? Like I did not want to be identified, there's a fly, I didn't want to be identified as a person of color activist or anything like that. And so when I was organizing in School Strike for Climate and everything, probably until I joined SUPNA, which is a South Asian climate justice group I'm at now, which I'll get into, I had never once mentioned I was a person of color. We'd done media training, we'd done all of those things, telling our personal narrative, and not one time was it ever brought up like, hey, do you want to touch on this, or did I ever think of it either? Instead, like, I had friends who would be talking about how their like great-grandfather was a coal miner and how difficult this journey was for them, and how they loved camping. And I was like, cool, I love nature too, this is why I care about the climate crisis. And it's definitely not, because when I think about the climate crisis, now that I actually have an understanding of what it is and the different justices that intersect, I think of the Chipko movement in India, which started in the 1970s, and this was, you know, groups of women hugging trees and trying to prevent deforestation. Like, that's what it was. And now all of a sudden here we're like, the hippie tree huggers, and it's like, no, that's not how it started. And you can't let that message continue, but also at the same time, you're in this really tough spot, I think, where you're trying to figure out your own identity because you've been so incredibly whitewashed, and then also trying to make sure that you're not speaking for a community, because I have not lived in India to go and talk about, oh, you know, like these communities are being affected like this, and now I'm going to represent 1 billion or more people. And I think that's what's expected of us a lot of the time. Like, you're invited to things, you'll be the only person of color there, and then suddenly they're like, talk about all the impacts in South Asia. And like, I can't. I'm sorry about it. Like, I don't know enough and I can't do that, and it wouldn't be fair. And another thing I've also noticed is the intersection of being a person of color, but then also being a settler on this country, is something that has been really, really eye-opening and should just be, it should be common sense almost, but it isn't, because it's not talked about enough. And Amy and I, we were actually talking about this before the panel, but the idea of like environmental organizations kind of dealing with like First Nations and people of color like almost separately at times. It's like, oh, but you're all like minorities. It's not the same thing though, because there's plenty of people of color who still don't understand the injustices and like being on stolen land. So a lot of the work at SUPNA now has been obviously amplifying the voices of South Asians back in South Asia and the climate impacts that they're facing, because it's one of the most vulnerable spots to climate impacts, but then also making sure that we know our place as settlers on this country, the amount of privilege that we inherit, and also systems like capitalism and things like that a lot of the times do work in our favor. As much as they work against us, it is kind of, you know, the model minority to do really well at school, get a high-paying job, and then you're all set for life. and the intersections of that with then activism and NGOs and all of it kind of coming together is just a lot of unpacking to do, and I still don't think I fully unpacked it, which you can probably tell. But I think just acknowledging those differences and the work that needs to be done is so key to actually achieving climate justice.
Totally. Yeah, well done. And I think, I've read some reports from the UK that came out talking about the incessant lack of diversity in environmental organisations. So these companies that are getting the most funding from their governments at the leading edge of solutions for climate, but just fully white-run organisations. And something that I've started to see pop up a lot is like this idea of like regenerative practitioners and even the term like sustainability. That doesn't exist in Indigenous cultures. And Amy, I'd love for you to expand on that.
I try to ignore those people as much as I can. But I think we need to think about where that knowledge comes from, of like, it is First Nations communities, it's Black communities, it's brown communities that a lot of this knowledge comes from. And a lot of the time these like sustainability, wellness people are not from those communities, and that's a really big problem. I think there's also this issue around a lot of the time the movement talks about renewable energy being the only thing that's going to save us from the climate crisis.
Green growth.
But the green growth, and at the end of the day, those projects are still happening on stolen land. And I think there was like some news this week about some mob, about a project that they were saying no to this project. And so just because it's a renewable energy project doesn't mean you don't have to get consent. It doesn't mean like you're not doing this project on stolen land. And so I don't care if it's a renewable energy project. If mob are saying no, it can't happen. And so I think we need to look at these industries that are supposed to save us from this climate crisis and look at who is behind them and also where that knowledge has come from, because a lot of the time it isn't from the communities that it's actually coming from, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and just on that, like, I think the renewable energy industry is so close to being just like the coal industry, because 200 years ago, if you think about it, we were all probably, not us, we weren't sitting in that room, but like a bunch of stale, pale male, whatever, we're sitting in a room being like, we're going to revolutionize the world, coal is going to be the new thing, everyone's going to be so happy. We steamrolled Indigenous land consent, all of that, and now I think renewable energy is really close to doing the same thing. And even when you look at things in India, so my family's from there, and when you look at things like the forest rights legislation and the movement that's been, legislated there, where it's basically like, we're going to save the forest, but then kick all the Indigenous people out of the land to save the forest, that's not doing anything. Like, these people have lived, they have their livelihoods there, and in the name of saving and like conservation, you're going to kick them out. It doesn't make any sense. And even here, yeah, like, justice, like that should be the main focus, and having renewable projects that's going to lead us to a sustainable future doesn't make any sense, because sustainability is supposed to be about coexisting and all of that, and instead we have green capitalism now, which is like the new trending thing that every corporation wants to adopt to be seen as like the best ones to invest in or whatever, but they're doing the exact same thing as every other company.
And I think when you've got companies like Origin, who are now taking this brand of like renewables and greenwashing, when only, 6 months ago they were fracking in the NT, like, that's a problem. And they're using this cover of greenwashing and sustainability to hide their past practices to sell more product, really.
Yeah. They're still existing in a system of capitalism which is based off extraction, exploitation of peoples. And so I guess that stresses what Leah was talking about, where environmentalism by itself can actually cause more damage. We need to understand racism, we need to understand capitalism in order for these solutions to actually be effective and complete. So yeah, and I'd love to just quickly tap onto COP27, because obviously it's just happened right now. the 27th COP. It's been, 50 years since we've known about climate change now, and here we are. How was COP this year? How did we go there?
I feel like there wasn't heaps of media coverage around it. I don't know if it was just me, but I found it wasn't really there, and I think people are just tired of it. It's like 27 of these, and what? I think the whole loss and reparations, great. We're finally talking about that, but I think just, living up to all of that is kind of what scares me. And also, I think like real fundamental change obviously needs to be at that level of like governmental level, but then also at the grassroots level as well. If our grassroots movements aren't representative of actual communities, then it's going to be really hard to see any real change reflected on the major sort of scale. And SUPNA recently released a report about the experience of South Asian school strikers in Australia and how a lot of them actually left the climate movement because of the blatant racism and how bad it was. There's so much of emotional labour. So if we can't fix those things within our own movement, within our little bubble, then how can we fix the whole issue? I guess is something that I've been thinking about with COP.
And I think when you've got people like Twiggy Forrest, who is the architect of the cashless debit card, which is the racist punitive welfare card that a lot of mob are on, were. It's now been wound back a bit. When people like him are in the room at events like this, that's really concerning, because we know the power that this man holds over governments and corporations. And so when that's the advice that these people are getting, it's a really big concern. And I think from what little I saw of COP, I saw a lot of First Nations communities, Torres Strait mob, a bunch of mob from the Pacific protesting. And I think that always just speaks volumes, right? When it's First Nations communities having to come out and protest time and time again these events because we're not doing enough, and we've got people like Twiggy in the room.
Absolutely. And we were talking earlier before, and you were saying how just the oppression that First Nations people are under here, in contrast to, for example, the white middle class who tend to make up the environmental movement, how does that impact your activism as well?
I mean, when you look at the environment movement, Varsha's already said it's largely white middle class, lots of money, lots of time. But that's the professional climate movement. I don't actually, they can do what they need to do. I think the fights are happening in community. A bunch of those communities I mentioned at the start, Gomeroi mob, Torres Strait Islander mob, the Tiwi Islands mob who are fighting Santos in court, mob fighting fracking, mob over in the Kimberley. That's the fight that's happening, and that's where we're actually going to win this thing. And so when I think about who's fighting the climate crisis, it's those mob. It's the climate movement over here and the work happening over here. Yeah.
And how can you envisage that being more inclusive? What do you want from the rest of society to support you?
I mean, they kind of just need to get out of the way. The amount of resources and time that has been sucked up. And, I think we've done a lot of work trying to work within the climate space, and it's a hard space to work in. And I think there's there's some really great people in there doing really great work. But I think generally these big NGOs that are run by, white men, it's really hard to work in, and that's not where actual climate action is happening. It's happening in those communities who are on those front lines, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And just on that, I think having a South Asian space now that's working to amplify the voices of South Asian activists in Australia and also back in South Asia, there's a real sense of having to legitimise your work that I don't think a lot of white-run and white-led organisations would face, because you first have to find a community. There's not, it's so difficult to actually find South Asians a lot of the time, because either they've left the movement because of racism, or, their families aren't the most supportive because they're please get a stable job. there's so many different levels of security of going to a protest and being targeted by police. Like, those are big fears for parents, and they're so valid, and those things aren't considered by the broader environment movement. A lot of the time you need to fit into this, radical aesthetic of, I go to protests all the time, I run from cops, I dress a certain way, I do all of these things, when in reality, you can't afford to do that for your own security. So with us, I think, like with Sapna, it's legitimizing our work and saying that, no, we're not holding protests every 2 weeks, but we're trying to actually build a community that feels safe, where we can have conversations like this about race and the intersections of everything. So yeah, when you have those massive organizations taking up space and resources, makes it difficult for the rest of us.
Totally. I'm just going to check how we're going for time. 3:10. We're finishing at 3, right?
3:30?
3:30. Are we? Okay, we can keep going then. Cool. Beautiful. We have more time than I thought. All right, so where should we start? I want to talk about the intersection of gender and climate justice as well. Maybe I'll start with like leadership first as well, because what I saw at COP was the lack of representation of women at the decision-making table, but then also what's come out of that is this commitment to loss and damage has come from countries that are being led by women. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. How you see the role of gender, whether it's...
Yeah. I mean, I think the movement, like most of the work for climate justice, is led by women. I think they bear the brunt of the impacts of the climate crisis. Like in Pakistan, there's been plenty of reports saying that, it's pregnant women that are out working under like blistering heat right before pregnancy and right after pregnancy. And those are things that a lot of other people in a lot of other countries don't face. So I think the fact that these massive decisions are just being led by men, it's just so reminiscent of the coal industry. And I'm like, have we moved forward at all? Sometimes I think is what these massive conferences make me think about. And yeah, just the lack of representation and the fact that it's women-led countries that are, again, fighting for loss and damage and basic compensation for everything industrialization that's been championed by countries like Australia are now facing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think when I look around the room of who's doing the work, it is women and non-binary people. And I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of this work is really care work and, going out and organising and the conversations you need to have and the care and the communication you need to have. That's where it sits because of the society we live in. And so I think the leaders that I look up to, the elders that I look up to, like my peers, are mostly women and non-binary people, and that's the reality of it. But then that's the flip side of that is actually the decision makers aren't those people though. The decision makers in these organisations are men, and the decision making is around funding and, where we're putting our efforts sit with men. And, I remember, so we work on a fracking campaign in the NT. We work on it at Get Up with my team. We're all First Nations team. We were working on it over at Seed Youth Indigenous Climate Network. And I remember Larissa, who now runs Get Up, who's a First Nations woman, she was going around trying to convince the climate movement that gas was the fight that we needed to have. Gas was what the next fight was going to be. This was maybe, 8 years ago. And none of the men would listen to her. And, look where we are right now. All of the big fights are around gas basins in this country. And they wouldn't listen, and they chose to spend their money elsewhere. And it was, our team over here doing this work. And those decisions, we weren't the ones making those decisions. We weren't the ones in the room.
I'd actually love for you to go a bit deeper onto some of these gas projects or what's actually happening on the ground. Can you talk about some of these projects that are going on?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a bit about what's happening in the NT because it's the one we've been working on. There are a bunch of companies who are wanting to frack the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory. Huge landmass. They've been trying to start this project for the last 10 years. Since they started, the traditional owners in the NT have been saying no. They have really big concerns about cultural heritage. They have really big concerns about climate change. They have really big concerns about the impact that that fracking will have on water. For those that don't know, when you frack, you dig underneath the ground and you go through, you go under all of these layers of ground basically, and the NT relies on that groundwater for survival more than any other state or territory in the country. And so they had really big concerns about water. It's also tied up, water is their songlines and like cultural heritage. A bunch of their sacred sites are also underground. So really big concerns saying no. What they had was these gas companies railroading consent, getting consent from a bunch of aunties who we work with and we talk to who don't want this project to go ahead, but were signing these agreements. They had no interpreters when they were signing these agreements. These old aunties don't, English isn't their first language. These are real legal, jargony kind of contracts, and so they were signing it away. These companies railroaded consent. They then, we had, 10 years of a Conservative government who was pumping money into these projects because they wanted this to get off the ground when the private sector wasn't going to fund it because they knew that this project wasn't viable. So basically we've had 10 years of a campaign going with traditional owners, with pastoralists, with communities all across the country who've been saying no to fracking. This year we actually had Origin pull out of that project. It's really unique. Origin has such a big name in this country. Like Origin supplies most of the gas to our homes. And so for them to pull out of this project is just like really, really huge. They saw that it wasn't viable. They saw the issues with the project. They saw that they were never going to get consent from traditional owners. Unfortunately, they sold their license to a company called Tamboran, who are basically a bunch of cowboys from the US. They're funded by oil and gas tycoons out of Texas. They tried to sue the Irish government when they were fracking in Ireland, and they didn't have any of the proper permits to frack. The Irish government tried to revoke their license, so they tried to sue the Irish government. They took a bunch of public money for this project. Look, they're cowboys basically. They don't care about consent. They don't care about traditional owners. Last week I was in Sydney with a bunch of mob from the NT at their AGM. We had a big rally outside. We then went inside and one of the traditional owners, Bradley, was asking them questions and asking about their concerns, and they tried to fob him off, but he was so staunch, and he got them to get me to an on-country meeting with a bunch of traditional owners early next year, which is really huge. But I think, the only thing standing in the way of this project is those traditional owners in Borroloola, in Mineary, in the Beetaloo Basin, who for 10 years have been saying no. We now have a Labor government who is saying they're going to act on climate change. They've had this climate change bill, but yet they're still funneling public money into this project. They're still ignoring the wishes of traditional owners. And so, yes, we have a Labor government, but
racism still exists.
Exactly. Exactly. It's still they're still very conservative, and they're still really tied to the fossil fuel industry.
Oh yeah, $1.5 billion of public subsidy.
$1.5 billion to the Middle Arm project, which basically, if that project goes ahead off the coast of Darwin, will open up the Beetaloo, because the Middle Arm project will use the gas from the Beetaloo Basin. So they gave $1.5 billion in the last budget to that project. Like, that is money that could be going to communities, that could be going to healthcare, that could be going to housing in remote communities. This is what these communities are saying, this is what we need, yet they're over here spending $1.5 billion over here. And so all these issues are just so interconnected, right? And, you know, I think this is just one of the biggest fights in the country, because if this basin, you know, is opened up, it'll basically blow the carbon budget for this country, and no amount of climate policy is going to change that. It's big.
Huge.
Yeah.
And how well known is this issue? Do you think people are talking about it enough?
No.
No.
And I mean, that's the job that we have to do, right? Is to make sure that this is a toxic project all across the country, that people in Adelaide are talking about it, people in Cairns are talking about it, and are talking to their MPs about it, are calling their MPs, are like, you know, going to rallies, are, you know, turning out for this, because that's the only way we're going to stop this. You know, Tamboran fronted the Senate inquiry into fracking recently, and they said, unlike the US, the only reason fracking hasn't been rolled out across this country is because of the opposition here. And I think that's really huge. Like, this company is admitting that we're the thing standing in their way. And so we need to keep going, and we need to keep building, and that's how we're going to stop this project. Yeah.
Awesome. So we're coming to the end of the session, and I want to wrap it up by asking both of you, there was one thing you could ask for towards climate justice, what would it be?
Okay, I would say, like, actually having a real meaning for justice and understanding what that is. So in my view, it means First Nations-led solutions, means understanding that, and then having your frontline communities supporting that. Yeah, so I would just say really understanding justice, because I think it's just such a buzzword and people chuck it in everywhere to seem woke. You're not woke for chucking it in, and I think even with allyship, we see that. Like, I was at a protest recently and was with two other brown girls who were South Asians, and this woman comes up to me and is like, I'm an ally. I'm like, I don't care. Good for you, queen. Like, you can be an ally. And then she took a photo of my friends and I, because she'd probably never seen like more than one brown person at a strike before. And I was
So tokenistic.
yeah, and honestly, like, I think it's truly understanding justice and realizing that the only way we can ever get any sort of climate justice at all is with First Nations led work, and making sure to support that instead of creating more emotional labor there.
I think it all comes down to land rights and sovereignty, and, you know, land back. And, you know, that's all of these fights, that's what communities are calling for. They're calling for sovereignty and decision making, and needing to have consent of their land and decision making over what's happening on their country. And so if we do that, that's the solution.
Totally.
Yeah.
Thank
and
you.
that's it.
Thank you
We've got to do it.
so much for joining us. I love that conversation in the end. I'm really glad that you were both here. Let's all give a round of applause. We're now going to have a seal come up and sing a song for us to close this session. Do you want us off the stage? Yeah, okay, cool. Let's go.
Stay there, I need company. Hello, everybody. Do you mind if I just sit here? It would be much easier for me. I'm so inspired by today. I haven't been early in the morning, but I just came for the last part of the session before this one. And I'm so happy that I could at least hear the amazing speakers. There's few kind of thoughts in my brain, and some people came to me after and said, like, we didn't understand what you said. You mesmerized us, but we didn't know what you were saying. So I just brought the lyrics so I can share with you and I can translate. The very first song I'm gonna sing is like a very short one, unless you want to. It's kind of is a song for home, and as I told you before, we tell stories about home and having to leave it, and we tell it through culture, art, food, and listening to the inspiring talks. I am actually making a show, a children's show, bringing me and my Palestinian culture and my friends and brothers and sisters, First Nations, and many First Nations around the world to tell exactly that if only colonizers didn't use our lands, how the world would be better. So I will ask Irfan later on when it's on to bring you in it. It's a beautiful collaboration. First, I'm gonna sing for home, and it's what I'm gonna say. It's a mawal, and talking about First Nations, about land. We say قالوا إجا العيد. They say Eid is here, and Eid, for those who don't know, it's our celebration after Ramadan. And we say the Eid is for those who celebrated. شو بينفع العيد? What is the use of Eid? للي مفارق أحبابه. For those who have left their homes. العيد يا يما. Eid is actually my mom. لما بلادنا بتعود, when our land is back and free, ونرجع على أرض الوطن, and we're back to our home country, and نبوس ترابه and kiss its own soil. And that's how it goes. قالوا إجا العيد, قالوا إجا العيد, قلنا العيد لأصحابه. شو بينفع العيد للي مفارق أحبابه. العيد يا يما, العيد يا يما, العيد يا يما, لما بلادنا بتعود, ونرجع أرض الوطن, ونرجع أرض الوطن, ونرجع أرض الوطن, ونبوس ترابه. The next song The next song is about those who don't give up, and it's really inspired by the last session you had. And it's a song that says, like, this is where I believed. I just need to remember it. So, when you sing, you don't need to remember how to translate. This is where I started believing. And they said, like, you're just making it up. You don't need to know. And that's what we all face when we come here as migrants. Like, do you really do this? Or, like, everybody's like, doesn't believe really, or like how much we are talented and how much we can contribute to the places around us. So he said, like, here we believed, and I never gave up or have my hands up, and I walked in this kind of land, and I continued. So it's, as I said, it's a longer song, but that's kind of the spirit of it. هنا صدقت حلمي وبدأت قالوا عني زمان ما هم بيضيع وقت لا يوم سلمت ولا استسلمت ووقعت وقمت وامبارح غير دلوقت هنا قلبي من جوا ده اللي بيديني القوة بطريق مشيت واريني وصلت واللي زمان ضحكوا عليك شوفهم دلوقتي بيداروا كسوفهم وهو رهنوا عليك تخسر وكسبت. That's it. And the last one I asked your mom, Irfan, what's the one word you would love me to sing about? And there was other people around, and they said love. And we say in Palestine that يسعد البطن اللي حملك, which means that may the womb that carried you be happy, which is basically saying no matter how great you are, there's someone that made you like that. And I believe that that's kind of me to thank your parents for being here as well. And like, you know, we are nothing without great parents that support us and without the mom that made us who we are. This is a very short one too, and it talks about the owl, that everybody misinterprets the owl. They all think that they're not that good like things to see, but I love owls. And it says, نيالك مهدبالك يا طير البوم. It's like, oh, lucky you like owl. جبت السعد لحالك وانا المحروم. And it talks about love in a different way. And it's kind of about all of us standing together to kind of share and change. And it says, نيالك مهدبالك يا طير البيت, حشت الورد لحالك وانا ضليت, وجرحي صاح من يا ناس داويني, جرح الهوى مر من السكاكيني, نيالك مهدى بالك شو عبالك, وانا ذويت وشلت السعيد لحالك. Thank you.